What's up, party people? We got this video here to introduce you to topic two while you're at home, which is related to the course and practices of World War I or the First World War. Again, the second topic of three. We'll get to the effects after this, but this is kind of introduce you to some of the things we'll be talking about a little more and reading about a little bit more in class. And there'll be a short reading assignment that goes along with the Schlieffen plan when this is over as well. So we'll keep track of that. There's only one objective really for this, and that's to describe the nature of fighting during the First World War on land, in the air, and at sea. So when we talk about these different types of wars, when we're analyzing the course of them, we're going to be looking at those types of issues. So I don't have a specified note sheet for this. If you would like one, I kind of give you some ideas about how to take notes for this, but really it's kind of going to be a little more definitional, just understanding what's going on in general. So just to recap where we're at, in August 1914, we had the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. At the end of June, you had the July crisis. So you got this triggering of that conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, which eventually kind of boils over into the rivalry and the war between Austria-Hungary and Russia in the Balkans, which then triggers the long-term anxieties that we talked about within the pre-mortem. And then you get these failed diplomatic attempts. So again, we talk about Britain as kind of like the governor or the mediator ideologically, being tied up with what was going on in Ireland at the time. So nobody really there to act. A lot of the people that are in the governments of these nations become overwhelmed with what's going on throughout the continent at the time. So you have these various conferences that are proposed, negotiations, but they all fail either because of mistrust or some of those long-term causes that are over in that box to the right, or just a desire for war. Although it was, like it says, although this is more controversial, it was a little more controversial. It wasn't like everybody was gung-ho after a war at this time. Sorry. But the one thing that having a war does do is it makes things a little more clear. It provides clarity to people about what is actually happening, which is kind of a weird, perverse way to think about it. But if you look back on it, a lot of these people feel like now we know what's going on, at least we're in this conflict. So, and then you have these mistakes and wrongful assumptions in the diplomacy about what different groups are willing to do or able to do. And we'll get into that a little bit as well as we go. So before we get into that, though, there's a couple terms that you need to know and be comfortable with and be able to apply when you're studying military conflicts specifically. And it only rears its head when we're talking about specifically the course and the practices of the war. So just understanding what we're talking about. And I use the example throughout this of D-Day, which is World War II, Second World War. Just remember, I'm just giving an example of something that people generally know about in order to develop these. So levels of war are often referred to as practices. In IB lingo, they like to say the practices of war, how the war is carried out. So when we're looking at and analyzing practices, the first top level of it is going to be the strategy. So people often use strategy interchangeably with some of these other examples, and it's not technically true. So the strategy is the top level of conducting warfare or military presence. So it's the use of military power to achieve one or more political ends. And it's important that kind of have this understanding that war is an extension of policy. War is an extension of the government of a nation trying to achieve some kind of goal. So the question to think about, I guess, as we go through is like, what are these different nations' political goals? What are they trying to achieve? Because they've all gone to war. What is like the end game that they're trying to accomplish by doing this? So Germany is literally looking at territorial expansion. Russia and Austria-Hungary are looking at the Balkan regions. But then it's kind of like, what is the goal of Britain in all of this? What is the goal of Serbia? What's the goal of eventually Italy when they get involved? So the grand strategy is generally a country's overall foreign policy, but then we look at strategy specifically to achieve those political ends. So D-Day, for example, the overall strategy of D-Day was to open a Western front in the European theater and eventually liberate France from Nazi occupation. So that's like the general strategy within the broader scope of World War II in the European theater, is to open up a second front or a true Western front in Europe. Okay, so next underneath that you have what is generally referred to as operations, which is the positioning and movement of major forces. So kind of the big endeavors that the military engages upon in different areas of war in order to achieve those strategic objectives. So things like having your field armies in certain places, having your air force doing certain military engagements. Trying to do this without saying the word operations. Having different fleets and the Navy gain advantages over the enemy. So those are all going to be examples within your operations. So these are like the big endeavors that occur to achieve the strategy. So in D-Day, you had a couple things happening. You had an amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy. You had coordinated air cover. In addition, you had decoys that were placed at various locations to confuse the enemy. All of those things are operations that are being done to achieve said strategy. So after the strategy, what you start to think about is what operations do we need to achieve that strategy. And then finally, kind of at the bottom, you have tactics. And tactics, gaining tactical advantages, that's the methods of actually winning the battles and the engagements. It's the actual fighting that you engage upon and what is done in that fighting to try to achieve your strategic objectives during those operations. So the significance of technology will often start here. So when we talk about technology and technological advances in war, it will generally fall into the tactical level. In D-Day, you had storming the beaches to overthrow the defensive force. Just an all-out assault was the tactics that they used, which ended up being successful. So you'll see a variety of different tactics. And the key thing, I think, is that when you study various conflicts, you will see that sometimes nations they'll carry out all the tactics and operations the way they want to, but their strategy is just wrong, and they end up losing. Or they achieve all their strategic goals, or they try to achieve their strategic goals, but they're unable to. Sorry, that's what I meant. They're unable to because of their tactics. So a good example of this is in Vietnam when we get there, fourth quarter, is according to tactics and operations, like the U.S. really has an advantage. They accomplish a lot of their tactical and operational objectives, but their strategy was just off. None of that mattered in the grand scheme of things. So we'll take a look at that later. But that's kind of like the three big ways when we refer to practices, we talk about that. And I'll have a way for you to apply that to the Schlieffen plan in a little bit. Other thing we just need to make sure that we are totally good with is types of war. So essay questions often ask you to compare and contrast specific types of wars. Sometimes a conflict can fall into more than one category. We try to do those so that we can get the most bang for our buck here in what we choose to study. But there's three general types. The first is an interstate or a cross-regional war. So just knowing those are usually interchangeable. So these are wars fought between two or more nations and across various geographic regions, thus cross-regional, or in multiple theaters like at land and at sea or in the air. Those are generally interstate cross-regional wars. So World War I, World War II, Vietnam you could consider to be cross-regional. So most like big, large-scale wars are going to be interstate cross-regional. Civil wars are wars fought between a nation's government and its own civilians, thus civil. So civil war is generally contained, but there is going to be foreign influence sometimes. The American Civil War, at least from the Union's perspective, was a civil war. If you look at the Confederates' perspective, they might argue that it was an invasion. That was more interstate, but depends on your perspective there. Vietnam, from the perspective of the Vietnamese, is a civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Same with the Korean War. The Mexican Revolution was a war between various factions within Mexico. So those are all civil wars. They're involving a government's own civilians. And then finally, the one that IB at least likes to determine is guerrilla war. So it's technically a tactic, but it's the use of irregular tactics such as like hit and run, sneak attacks, armed civilians, ambushing people. Those are all examples of what's called guerrilla tactics, but sometimes they like to refer to that as a type of war, even though in my opinion that technically isn't accurate. But it's just something you can apply to various examples. So it's usually thought of as a type of war because of warfare's transition over time from like having very large standing armies all fighting in unison to more like quote unquote modern tactics where you don't need to have large standing armies to be able to conduct warfare. So that's kind of the significance of using the term guerrilla war. We'll get to this in a second, but I had a spot here if we were actually doing this in class for the Schlieffen Plan article, because the Schlieffen Plan article does a good job, I think, of just giving you some basics, one, of what was happening during the war, but also, or the First World War, and also looking at operations and strategy and things like that, applying it. So the First World War was a new, relatively new type of conflict. It's generally seen as the first modern total war. Another good term to know, if you're not familiar with total war, generally you can determine a total war if the civilian non-combatant population becomes directly impacted by the war effort. So if, again, by civilian non-combatant, I mean the people generally in a lot of nations, the civilians make up the armed forces, but we're talking about the people that aren't involved in the combat. If they are directly impacted by the war effort, whether that's an invasion of their homeland or that's them being involved in the war effort through the economy, that's generally thought of as being total war. So in the Civil War, Sherman's March to the Sea becomes quote unquote total war because they start destroying things that are not related to the war effort. They start burning crop fields, destroying, well, I guess the railroads were technically involved in war effort, but destroying railroads, taking property, things like that. In World War II, America becomes the quote unquote like arsenal of democracy. That's going to be a total war, getting involved in the economics of the war effort. Nations at war mobilize resources and their civilian populations to a degree that had not been seen before. Generally, World War II gets a lot of hype and recognition for that, but the First World War is really one of the first big examples of that. And then new technology played a decisive role in the tactical efforts. So we'll talk more about that as we get more in depth with it. Also, there were some early plans that failed, which means that they had to revert to various new types of war. So Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, which I've got the article about that you'll look at. Russia was able to mobilize troops early. So part of Germany's strategic outlook was that Russia would not be able to mobilize its troops as quickly. That's a picture of or a diagram of the Schlieffen Plan. But they were able to do that, which was expressed in the Russia slideshows as well. The French had this plan called Plan 17, which was to take the offensive across Lorraine, which was in contrast to the Schlieffen Plan because they were looking at actually attacking via the border between Germany and France instead of having this neutrality across Belgium. I kind of forget exactly where Alsace-Lorraine is. I believe it's kind of like down here in this area, but correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that's what it is. I'm sorry, geographically challenged. Austria-Hungary was to basically just beg help from Germany, and then Britain was to use the Navy and create a blockade to protect allies. So you start to see these plans start to get into place, but a lot of them have some degree of failure to them that actually ends up prolonging the war in some way. So also we divide the war into multiple fronts or theaters. So I'm just going to quickly give you the broad strokes context of that we will dive into a little bit more as we go. Oh, also, I sometimes take for granted the background knowledge, so I just want to make sure I offer this so that you know who's fighting on what side and who's involved in all of this. Sorry, I need some water. On the Allies side is generally who they're called, the United States allies. You have France, Britain, and Russia until 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution, and Russia leaves the war. Then from 1917 to the end of the war, you have the United States. But you also have Italy, Japan, Serbia, the kind of ground zero of the outbreak of war, and many, many other nations, because a lot of them were colonized by these various European countries at the time, so they're going to be involved as well. And then on the flip side, you have the Central Powers, including Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and then beginning in 1915, Bulgaria as well gets involved in the war. So those are the major nations on each side, just so you know. Copy them down if you're going to forget so you can remember. Just as a comparison, it's always kind of hard for me to fathom numbers in my head. I think it's just like it's type of the way my brain works. So I like to try to keep track. But you have about 43 million troops at full strength fighting for the Allies versus only 25 million for the Central Powers. And of that 25 million from the Central Powers, a lot of them came from Germany. Half of them almost came from Germany. Actually, more than half. I'm sorry, I can't do math apparently. Whereas in the Allies, you've got kind of a more equitable mix, I guess. I mean, Russia had a lot of troops that it had involved, but also Britain and France, and then Italy and the United States actually had relatively somewhat comparable amounts of troops that were involved. And then again, it doesn't add up to 43 million because there's a lot of other nations that were contributing troops as well. So that's the relative troop strength that you're looking at in terms of manpower. Again, remember Britain, a lot of this war was fought on, not a lot of it, but a big impact of the war was at sea as well, which was not involving standing armies. So just to give you a quick overview of the different fronts that we'll be looking at, kind of the most popular, especially because of a book and a movie called All Quiet on the Western Front, and because it focuses a lot on some of the nations that the U.S. became more involved with. You've got the Western Front consisting of mostly the area of Belgium and northern France. It involved a German invasion of France, and then Britain joined the war effort against the Germans on August 4th, 1914, which opened the war at sea. So you have not only this kind of stalemate going on between Germany and France, but you also have the British and the Germans mostly fighting at sea. So there's a picture of the trenches, which we'll get into a little bit later. On the flip side, you have the Eastern Front, and I kind of lump in the Ottoman Front as well, the front that was really involving the Ottoman Empire. So on the Eastern Front, you have Germany and Austria-Hungary against Russia and Serbia for the most part. It was mostly fought along the German-Russian border. And then on a little bit to the southeast, you have the Ottoman Front, which is the Allies launching an offensive assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which it kind of shows you is right down at the very southwestern tip. Here we're almost crossing into like Turkey, modern day Turkey. So they launched an offensive in 1915. So it took a while, and then Italy later joined the Allies after they were promised territory in this general region, so in the Mediterranean Sea area that they're operating in. You also had a couple other fronts that I'll get to really quickly. So it truly was a world war. Fighting took place in all of the following areas. In the Middle East, you had Russian troops in the northern Caucasus that were fighting British in present-day Iraq. Sorry, not fighting British. Sorry. You had the British fighting in present-day Iraq, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia. So the modern Middle East is going to be being developed, and a lot of European influence that leads to conflict later in history starts here. In the colonies, you had some limited fighting, but especially in Asia and Africa, they supplied men, material, so like goods for the war effort, weaponry, things like that, and food. In the air, you had a really big increase for the time in military use of air power. Planes were relatively rudimentary at this point. They're mostly used for reconnaissance or gathering information. You didn't have a ton of bombing raids or, excuse me, sorry, fighting over, off of aircraft carriers or anything like that. Mostly just used for gathering information. And then at sea, you had the German and British blockades and the German use of submarine warfare, which is eventually going to be the major factor in the involvement of the United States. So you've got the Lusitania, which was a British liner that was had a lot of civilian passengers on it. It was kind of like secretly passing munitions to the Allies, and so they used that as kind of a focal point to try to get more people interested and involved in the war based on the submarine warfare that Germany was conducting. So just a quick overview, just to give you some of the broad strokes understanding of what was going on here and where things are happening and who's being involved. And we'll look more into the actual practices specifically as we go. So the next thing you're going to do is I have an article about the Schlieffen Plan, and it's a good example of how to apply some of those strategy, operations, and tactics vocab to a specific plan of war.